In this lecture video, we're going to tease out some of the characteristics of good government. We've seen what legitimizes government, which is the general will, a government which is based on and legislates according to the general will. But what are some of the characteristics then of such a government? Now, the end of legitimate government, meaning the purpose of a government which is legitimate, not simply the purpose of government, which might be more of a descriptive claim. We want to know the normative claim. So what should the purpose of a legitimate government be? And the first characteristic is civil freedom, defined as the following of one's own will. So this was established by the notion of the concept of the general will. So the purpose of a legitimate government would be the enabling of citizens to follow their own will. They are free to the extent then that they're able to determine their own will and carry through with it. Now, this actually is the distinguishing of a specific kind of freedom that is new in the history of Western political philosophy. In Thomas Hobbes, for example, freedom was defined basically as the absence of external impediments. This has come to be known as negative freedom, or freedom as preference satisfaction, because basically it says, well, look, if freedom is absence from external impediments or freedom from coercion, then basically I am free to the extent that whatever my desires or preferences are, I'm free to the extent that I can satisfy them, that no one is stopping me from, satisfying them. There's also another conception of freedom known as positive freedom. This basically is like the kind of, a lot of leftists, I would say, think of freedom in these terms as in like actually realizing the options that one wants. So that would be basically positive freedom is saying that all options are available. That, for example, you wouldn't say that, or someone that says freedom is positive freedom wouldn't say that we are free to have health care because, you actually have to have money, and you then have to, the more money you have, the better care you get. But instead that, one would be free if they have access to health care that, doesn't cost money. Same thing with housing, right? They would say, well, look, positive freedom in terms of housing would say that everybody has access to housing. Not everybody has access to housing to the extent that you have money to guarantee your housing. But instead, all the different options of housing are available. Now, what Rousseau is arguing is something different. This has come to be known as Republican freedom, or, as it has been theorized by the contemporary philosopher Philip Pettit, freedom as non-domination. That is, Republican freedom is the notion of the absence of subjection to the will of others. That you are free to the extent not merely that your preferences can be satisfied, not merely that all the options are available, but that you are able to choose what options you want and be able to pursue them without, the interference of others. The reason is because if freedom is simply negative freedom, then, well, who determines what my preferences are? Maybe, somebody's not going to stop me from choosing my preferences, but they might cultivate, they might condition me to enjoy certain things over others. To that extent, then, we wouldn't be free in terms of our own will, only in some kind of like formal political sense, we could say. What about positive freedom? All options are available. Now that's great because economically speaking then, it would seem like all those things that are available. There's no economic barrier to, for example, having housing or healthcare. But who enables those things to be available? So the political freedom might be a little bit sketchy then, because you could technically, living under a tyrant, have positive freedom to the extent that the tyrant ensures that you have all the options you want. Your healthcare needs, your housing needs, everything else. But of course, at a moment's notice, the tyrant could decide, nope, I don't want you to have those things anymore, and they could take all of that away. The only thing that guarantees then that nobody can take those things away from you, and that there can be no absence to external impediments while guaranteeing all options are available, is when you have the freedom to form your own will, what you desire, and enable then the achieving of those things that you desire. The general will then is meant to enable this. It is meant to be the characterization of what that would be, of what freedom as non-domination would be. So Rousseau is the first to kind of theorize this notion of republican freedom. It's then later theorized further by Immanuel Kant. And so oftentimes contemporary versions of republican freedom are kind of a synthesis of Rousseau and Kant's conceptions of freedom as non-domination, as well as maybe, some other like Marxist insights or things like that as well. But it really has its origins here with Rousseau. At least its substantive origins. Now, the second end of legitimate government is going to be civil equality. And that doesn't mean then that a good government enables equality of outcomes where everyone is equal, everyone has an equal amount of power, but it is a just distribution of power that enables freedom. And that is civil equality. That, Rousseau says, with regard to equality, this word must not be understood to mean that the degrees of power and wealth should be absolutely the same, but rather that, with regard to power, it should be incapable of any violence and never be exercised except by virtue or rank and the laws, and that, with regard to wealth, no citizen should be so extremely rich that he can buy another, and none so poor that he is constrained to sell himself. This presupposes moderation in goods and influence on the part of the great, and moderation in avarice and covetousness on the part of the lowly. So basically, civil equality is an equality of empowerment in decision-making procedures. Rousseau asks, do you then want to give the state stability? Bring the extremes as close together as possible. Tolerate neither extremely rich people nor beggars. So, legitimate government is one that is based on and legislates according to the general will. But we have to distinguish the aspects of, what have now kind of been blurred together, the state, sovereign, and government. So firstly, we should understand the state to be synonymous with the sovereign, and the state then is that entity within which the government resides, such that it is the public force consisting of its own agency that unites with and puts into action the general will. So the state, or the sovereign, is, in other words, the general will realized through power, right? The ability to use force to carry out the general will. But how exactly is the general will carried out? What kind of policies and laws would be carried out and defended? That would be the government. So Rousseau understands the government to be the legislative apparatus which enacts and regulates the general will by passing laws. So, in other words, the government is kind of that entity which is given power and is given the right to enact and regulate the general will by the passing of laws. Rousseau says, an intermediary body established between the subjects and the sovereign for their mutual communication and charged with the execution of the laws and the maintenance of freedom, civil as well as political, is the government. So the government is then a body within the sovereign, and it is legitimized by and given power by the sovereign, which is none other than the realization of the general will, or at least the material realization of the general will. A good and legitimate government depends on the mean proportional to A is to B as B is to C. What does this mean? Well, basically, Rousseau is concerned with governments that become too big, or if they're too small, or if the state ends up having too much power and the government not enough power, right? The way in which these proportions could be off. and undermine the ability for not only the general will to be realized, but to be carried out. So we can understand A to be sovereign or the state, B to be government, and C to be citizens. And basically what Rousseau is saying is it should always be the case that whatever the relation is between citizens and government, the same should be the relation between government and sovereign. So he says, as there is only one proportional mean for each ratio, there is also only one good government possible in a given state. But as 1,000 events can change these relations within a people, not only can different governments be good for various peoples, but they can be good for the same people at different times. So sometimes you might have a higher number of citizens, right? Well, how they are going to relate to the government, the legislative body, is going to differ. You might need a larger legislative body. But you don't then want a weaker state. You need a state that's comparable to the legislative body, the government, as the citizens are in relation to the government. And that then depends on the quantity of the population as well as perhaps the makeup of the population, the culture, and the environment, as well as how spread out. So do you have a densely populated society, or is it a society more spread out, more rural? That's going to affect then the makeup of the legislative body in relation to the citizens, and then the legislative body in relation to the state. And the power may be needed, you might need greater power over a densely populated area as compared to maybe a population of the same size but spread out over a larger territory. So let's put a little more substance to this. Rousseau basically says if that's trying to understand the proportion of good government in abstract terms, what do we mean concretely? And Rousseau says, look, there are three basic forms of government. The smallest form is direct democracy. The less people, the weaker the executive power needs to be. So the weaker then the state or the sovereign needs to be, because each has greater sovereign power than in a larger sized society. He says, he who makes the law knows better than anyone how it should be executed and interpreted. However, a people that would never abuse government would not abuse independence either. A people that would always govern well would not need to be governed. So if the government it becomes too small and the people too small, then at some point you don't need government anymore because there is so much power within each individual because they become their own sovereign. The smaller the government gets, the smaller the population gets. Now, what about on the other extreme, larger population? Well, that would be where we see a monarchy come into play. The larger the populace, the stronger the executive power needs to be. He says, while there is no government that is more vigorous because of its ability to execute law, there is none in which the particular will, and that is the particular will of the monarch, has greater sway and more easily dominates the others. So there's more of a tendency to violate the general will. Everything moves toward the same goal. It is true, but that goal is not public felicity, and the very force of the administration constantly works to the detriment of the state. So the best possible form of government would be a representative aristocracy. An aristocracy meaning in the Aristotelian sense of those who deserve to rule, a meritorious form of government. This would be for medium-sized societies because they require less executive power than a single prince, but more than a democracy, where you can try to get those proportions of A is to B as B is to C. So he says, in a word, the best and most natural order is for the wisest to govern the multitude, as long as it is certain that they will govern it for its advantage and not for their own. But it must be noted that the corporate interest begins here to direct the public force less in accordance with the general will, and that another inevitable decline takes from the laws a portion of the executive power. So there are also issues within a representative aristocracy as well. How do we know then when we actually have a good government? What are the signs? Well, Rousseau thinks that there is no simply best form of government because it varies with time, place, and people. Government is something living, it's a living body. It is born and it dies, it decays over time. It is only vibrant to the extent that the people are vibrant, and they are vibrant in a political, civic sense. Now, there's actually a dispute about what is the sign? How do you know when you have a good government? So Rousseau says of this dispute that if one were to ask by which sign one might know whether a given people is well or badly governed, this would be another thing altogether, and the question of fact could be resolved. Yet it is not resolved, because everyone wants to resolve it in his own way. Subjects praise public tranquility. Citizens, they praise the freedom of private individuals. One prefers security of possessions, and the other that of persons. One would have it that the best government is the most severe, the other maintains that it is the mildest. This one wants crimes to be punished, and that one for them to be prevented. One thinks it a fine thing to be feared by one's neighbors, the other prefers to be ignored by them. One is satisfied when money circulates, the other demands that the people have bread. And even if they were to agree on these and other similar points, would we have gotten any farther in answering this question about when do you know when you have a good government? But this is what Rousseau is trying to say. Since moral quantities like, whether good government is a matter of tranquility or freedom or security, he says moral quantities lack a precise measure. Even if there were agreement regarding the sign, how can there be so regarding the way to estimate it? There's only one way we can know if there is good government. And it actually reminds me of a quote given by a presidential candidate in 2020. His name is slipping me right now. Andrew Yang, where he said, how do we know whether a society is good or not? Are you living or are you dying? And Rousseau basically says something similar, that good government is signified when the population of a state is healthy and increases. He says, what is the end of the political association? It is the preservation and prosperity of its members. And what is the surest sign that they are preserving themselves and prospering? It is their number and their population. All other things being equal, the government under which the citizens, without external aid, without naturalizations, and without colonies, populate and multiply most, is infallibly the best. It's the only way to quantitatively determine whether or not a government is good or bad. Now, as I said, for Rousseau, governments are living things. That means they have tendencies to degenerate. And there are two ways in which this occurs. Two ways in which the social contract is broken, either by contraction or dissolution. When contraction happens, this is when you have the government usurping the general will and acting on behalf of their person or the body of the government, where basically you have the legislators who start to govern according to their own particular wills. They effectively then take over the sovereign. The legislative body becomes the sovereign, and the general will is dissolved. He says, the moment the government usurps sovereignty, the social compact is broken, and all ordinary citizens, returned by right to their natural freedom, are forced, but not obligated, to obey. The other form of degeneration is dissolution. And it's basically not when you have a hostile takeover of the government, where you start to force people to obey your laws, but instead when tacit consent is no longer given, when people stop participating in that form of government, when you lose the procedural aspect of the general will. It no longer exists, and instead, the proliferation of particular wills dissolves the state. Rousseau says, when the state dissolves, any abuse of government whatsoever takes the general name anarchy. So the natural consequence of dissolution is anarchy. So he says, the body politic, just like the body of man, begins to die right from the moment of its birth and carries within itself the causes of its destruction, which is that amor propria of society. So it comes right back once again. We cannot have utopia in civil society. We can only have a form of government which, at least for a moment, is able to operate according to the general will and to put at bay the kind of pride that so proliferates in civil society. Now I want to end with this quote from the first discourse, where Rousseau says, "As long as power is by itself on the one side, enlightenment and wisdom by themselves on the other, the learned will rarely think of great things, princes will even more rarely do noble things, and people will continue to be abject, corrupt, and unhappy." What we should want then is a government wherein we combine these things of enlightenment and wisdom and power. And for Rousseau, that is only with the general will, where you have this reconciling of freedom and the authority of the state.